Hello and welcome to Eye on Africa. I'm Ketavan Gorjistani, and these are the headlines. At least 140 people were killed over the weekend in Nigeria's central Plateau state. The attacks are believed to be linked to the country's herder-farmer crisis. All week, we'll be looking at the major events of the year on the continent, and today we'll be speaking to Paul Melly from CHatham House about the year in African politics. And we'll take a look at how North African craftsmen are fighting to pass down the ancestral art of metal engraving to the next generation. But we start first in Nigeria, where local officials say that armed groups have killed at least 140 people in the center of the country in a series of attacks that took place over the weekend. It was the bloodiest violence since 2018, when more than 200 people had been killed in the region, where clashes between the mainly Muslim Fulani herders and the predominantly Christian farmers are common. Nick Rushworth tells us more.
These people are fleeing violence in the Bokos area of Plateau state in central Nigeria. Local officials say military gangs launched attacks in not fewer than 20 different communities in the state. Dozens of people are reported to have been killed and hundreds wounded. A resident in one village told the French news agency AFP that villagers were taken by surprise, saying, "People hid, but the assailants captured many of us. Some were killed, others wounded." The governor of the state on Sunday condemned the violence, calling it barbaric, brutal and unjustified. His spokesman said, "Proactive measures will be taken by the government to curb ongoing attacks against innocent civilians." Amnesty International, meanwhile, has criticized the Nigerian government, saying the brazen failure of the authorities to protect the people of Nigeria is gradually becoming the norm. President Bola Tinubu said he will enact security measures in response to these attacks, but these promises have so far proven to be empty. There has been violence linked to jihadist conflict, bandit militias, and tensions between nomadic herders and farmers in northwestern and central Nigeria for years. President Tinubu took office in May. He has made the fight against insecurity one of the priorities of his mandate.
Law enforcement capabilities.
To the Democratic Republic of Congo now, where authorities want to ban a protest by the opposition, saying that it does not have any legal basis and is aimed at undermining the electoral process while results are still being compiled. Several opposition leaders have called for their supporters to take to the streets this Wednesday over last week's chaotic elections, which they say were marred by irregularities. Now, this week on the show, we will be looking back at the major events of 2023 on the continent, and today our focus will be on some of the key political events of the year. To discuss this, I'm joined by Paul Melly, a consulting fellow at the Africa program at CHatham House. Thank you so much for being with us. First, if you had to pick one major political event of this past year, what would it be?
I think the political event that's had the widest consequence has probably been the coup in Niger, precisely because it was so unexpected. Across the whole of West Africa, we've seen over the past several years a series of coups. We've seen a series of countries under extreme pressure, either from internal political questions, such as in Guinea, or the security crisis in the Sahel. But Niger was seen as a country that had managed to conduct a relatively stable electoral process in 2021 and seemed to be maintaining, if you like, constitutional stability. And that's the coup has, as it were, taken the level of challenge to orthodox politics across West Africa particularly to a new level. And it's a big challenge to the institutions, not just to ECOWAS, the regional bloc that has tried to maintain the principles of constitutional rule, but also even to the African Union. The criticisms, the sanctions imposed by ECOWAS, the criticism and the isolation, diplomatic isolation imposed by the African Union have proved completely fruitless, if you like, in convincing the soldiers who've staged the coup in Niger, but also those still in power in the other change course. And so it's a real challenge. That's why this event in one country, I think, has these wider consequences, even though, of course, we've had big elections in countries such as the Democratic Republic of Congo that you mentioned in the news, or Nigeria.
Now, you mentioned Niger. Of course, the last French troops left the country last week, French troops leaving other countries in the region. What does this mean for the fight against jihadist insurgency in the Sahel?
I think at a very practical level, it's part of a really big challenge because it's not just that the French have pulled out. Remember, the United Nations peacekeeping force in Mali, that's more than 13,000 soldiers, has just withdrawn at the insistence of the Malian government, which is another of these countries under military rule. And so there's a huge security challenge now. And although Mali and to a lesser extent Burkina Faso have begun to develop a new alliance, if you like, with Russia, with Wagner military contractor deployed in Mali in particular, the sort of forces that they are bringing, these new partners are bringing, don't begin to compare with the scale of coordinated security support that the UN, the French, other European countries, and the US to some extent have provided. And it's interesting that in Niger, again, the US has been reluctant to pull out and is engaged in a sort of negotiating process over the terms under which it might stay or restore its support because tackling the jihadist crisis and the wider security crisis, the pressures between farmers and herders right across Sahel and West Africa is a massive challenge, and it requires development as well as security. And when countries are politically isolated, both of those elements fall away.
And just quickly, looking ahead now to 2024, what is it that you will be watching out for?
I think in the very, very short term, the biggest challenge may come with the presidential election in Senegal in February and possible second round in March. Now, although President Macky Sall said he would not run again, his prime minister is the government candidate, but all eyes are really on Ousmane Sonko, who is the charismatic opposition leader who has huge support from Senegalese youth. And a legal battle is going on at the moment over his candidacy. He has deposited his candidacy papers with the authorities, but the government is still trying to stop him running. And if he is not allowed to take part, there could be a huge amount of tension in Senegal, and that could have wider regional ramifications. And then, of course, we have the ongoing crisis, particularly the crisis in Sudan and all the huge humanitarian challenges that poses, but to which there's no obvious, easy, early solution.
Paul Melly, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, earlier this month, North African metal engraving was added to UNESCO's Intangible Heritage List after 10 countries, including Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, petitioned to have the art form internationally recognized. Despite the prestigious UN label, the know-how is underappreciated in those countries, and local craftsmen are struggling to pass on their knowledge to the next generation. Clémence Valère has the story.
North African metal engraving, a craft steeped in centuries of tradition and history, but one that is struggling to find successors.
There is a lot of demand for corporate craftsmanship, but the problem is that there are very few people who know how to work the metal. There are no craftsmen left.
In early December, the North African art form was added to UNESCO's Intangible Heritage List following a campaign launched by a dozen Arab countries, including Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria. However, governmental support varies by country. While the majority of Moroccan chiselers now work in modern workshops, it is not the case for their Libyan counterparts. In a country torn apart by years of internal conflict, they point to a lack of support from the authorities. For this 60-year-old craftsman, the trade has little future.
I had 2 or 3 apprentices to whom I taught the profession. But what's the point? Teach them the trade and have them sit around and do nothing? Or so that they can't work and make a living from it? It's not worth it.
In Tunisia, a number of artists are offering courses and workshops in order to keep the know-how alive. Although engraving techniques are traditionally passed down from father to son, the majority of this man's students are women.
We're here to teach them the basics of the trade, how to engrave, solder, assemble and finish. Then they're free to engrave whatever they want, creating an object that reflects our times and what today's young people appreciate.
Even if, for some, the UNESCO label will not change the daily reality, it does motivate artisans to preserve these ancestral techniques.
And that's all for me. Thanks for watching.